I wanted to start off today with a different way of approaching it, a slightly different approach, because it is, after all, about humor and joy. And so I'm going to start with a magic trick. I know, how many times do we get to start one of these things with a magic trick, something unexpected? So I'm going to show you 3 ropes here. I have a short rope, which we'll refer to as yourself. I have a medium rope, which I'll refer to as the relationships you have with one other person. And I have a long rope, which I'll refer to as kind of the relationships you have with your community. So these are the 3 major relationships that we share. Partially, developing joy and humor, practices of joy and humor in your life, are around taking all 3 of these, looking at them and seeing if you can actually balance all 3 of them. 1, 2, 3 in equal measure. And then when you can do that, what you open up is a much larger possibility for what can occur. This is where the real magic happens. Remembering always that we come back to ourselves, our loved ones, and the larger community in which we sit. I know I can't see you out there applauding and cheering wildly, but I'm sure that you are. So let me tell you about last week as I was writing this talk. I spent about 2 days working on what I thought was the most brilliant brain science case I could on why we are feeling the way we are, how our brains are wired for predictability and habit, and now we're in the crazy soup freaking out and essentially building the case for why humor and joy, why we need humor and joy. It was fantastic. It was really quite good. I read it to my wife. She looked at me as if I had 2 heads and essentially said, do you really need to spend 15 minutes building a brain science case for why we need humor and joy right now in our lives? I mean, don't you think people get it? We're in the middle of a pandemic. Seems kind of obvious to me. As in most things, my wife was correct. And she reminded me that the word humor comes from the same root as human, humus, and humidity, meaning moisture. And when we lose our moisture, we get brittle and we break. During a pandemic, what more context do you need? So I embarked on the salon with a lesson in flexibility and non-attachment, 2 perfect entry points for what I'm about to talk about today. What I can say is this: we are freaking out, or many of us are at least struggling. And a big part of that struggle is how what we used to be able to predict and take for granted, we no longer can. Our unconscious habits, patterns, and personal rituals that help us navigate life and survive are, they're for shit. And this, maybe more than anything, requires a different form of response. Don't believe me? Don't quite understand how habit and pattern affects our lives? Tonight at dinner, if your kids are home or just with your spouse, sit at your dining room table in a different seat. Their seat. Just try that. Then you will firsthand experience what happens when unconscious habit meets unavoidable unpredictability. So with this shortened, obvious case as the backdrop, what is the antidote? It is simultaneously to put back into our lives 2 key ingredients. 1, to create new and different habits to help with predictability and generate joy. The other, conversely, is to put in surprise and the unpredictable, which is the foundation of most forms of humor. Example, a little old Jewish man comes back from the doctor's. His wife says, how are you? He says, not so good. She says, what's wrong? Doctor says, I've got herpes. Herpes? What's that? I don't know. She says, wait, I'll check. She comes back 5 minutes later. She says to her husband, Harry, don't worry. I just checked. It's a disease of the Gentiles. So Let's get definitional because joy and humor are not the same thing. Joy is what you feel when you realize that you are in love or feel a powerful connection with another living thing, or when you hear music or witness a beautiful sunrise or see art or read something that moves you or gets greeted by your dog after a long day. Humor, on the other hand, is a powerful way we can elicit joy and experience it. Now, not all of humor, of course, does this, but sometimes when everything falls into place just right, we cannot keep from laughing or help from laughing, and it is the joy that we experience. Specifically, however, the problem with overanalyzing humor and its facilitation of joy can best be summed up in a quote by E.B. White, who said, "Analyzing humor is like dissecting a frog. Few people are interested in it, and in the end, the frog dies." Now, I could literally talk for hours on the research on joy and humor, the different theories and their nuances. I did my first doctorate on the subject. Let's just leave it at this. For purposes of today, let's assume that the rabbit hole of definition between what is joy and what is humor and who said what about what is a dead frog waiting to happen, and instead focus on how do we bring more of it into our lives. In the end, the head stuff doesn't really matter, because if you're desperately crawling through the desert searching for water, some guy on Zoom describing the sand, it's just not that helpful. And let's assume that most people instinctively know joy and humor have a positive physiological impact. So I'll spare you the laundry list of health benefits because, well, that too could take a while, and my wife will give me another one of those looks. Here, however, and I can't resist early on, is one study that I do love. Did you know that 1 minute of laughter burns the same number of calories as 10 minutes on a rowing machine? Come on, that's gold. But as I said, this is not about why, this is about how.